Heading in week 10 fantasy football, you need to be looking at things as so make or break every single week with every single decision you're making as you're fighting for playoff spots here. And we need to find the edge any single way we can in fantasy football in week 10. So I've gone through some really important stats here, whether you will make or break week 10 fantasy football. And we're going to go through these. Just make sure to drop a like on this video and subscribe to the channel to show your support. So the first stat that I want to go through here is specifically with Zay Flowers here. Zay Flowers obviously had a massive game in week 9 versus the Denver Broncos. A really good defense, by the way. He totally destroyed the Broncos' entire defense by going for 30 plus fantasy points. He was a nightmare for the Broncos here. I want to look at it deeper though, because he has been absolutely fantastic since week 6 fantasy football. And I always say to look at fantasy football in terms of 4 quarters. Well, the last 4 weeks for Zay Flowers, he's been the wide receiver 2 in fantasy football in a half PBR format. In week 6, he had 17.9 fantasy points versus the Commanders here. Week 7 versus Tampa Bay, 3.5 fantasy points, which is, again, part of his problem because his floor is really low in fantasy football, and we'll get into that in a little bit here. Week 8 versus the Browns, 15 fantasy points. And week 9 versus Denver, 27.2 fantasy points in a half PBR format. This guy has been either boom or really, really bust in fantasy football for basically the entire year. This is Zay Flowers' nature right here. So with Zay Flowers, obviously there is a new development in Baltimore with Deontay Johnson. Deontay Johnson ended up being on a pitch count in that game versus the Denver Broncos because it was his first week there and they were just trying to get him used to this new offense. He ended up not producing at all. He had a goose egg in fantasy football. Do I think that's going to be the case moving forward? Of course not. They traded for this guy for a reason. They're going to have him involved in this offense. But again, these two guys are going to serve different roles. As I was saying leading into the week, I actually predicted that Zay Flowers might have a big game because Zay Flowers has moved all over the field. He's in the slot a lot. Deontay Johnson, the most of his career, he spent as an outside receiver here. That's what they're going to use him as in Baltimore as well. So Zay Flowers still holds this upside here. Now the problem obviously is this low floor, and I guarantee you it's not going anywhere. Especially with the addition of a new wide receiver in Baltimore, there's going to be weeks where Zay Flowers just doesn't do very well. But Zay Flowers being the wide receiver 2 since week 6, this is just a run that you need to take advantage of. I know I consistently have him ranked around the 20s in my wide receiver rankings here, but week 10 versus Cincinnati on Thursday night, I do believe this is another good matchup opportunity for Zay Flowers here, going up against this Bengals secondary, which is pretty soft versus wide receivers in fantasy. And also coming into a short week, I don't know how much more time Deontay Johnson needs to get adjusted to this offense, but if he's not ready on Thursday night, I would not be surprised. Zay Flowers needs to go right into your lineup, and he's no longer a guy that you should debate playing on a weekly basis in fantasy. For the time being, he goes into your lineup here. Now, the next stat that I want to cover here is in the same position, not nearly as positive. Malik Neighbors is a guy that we have really liked because he broke out right away in fantasy. Look, since week 6, he's the wide receiver 47 in fantasy football. It's been rough sledding for him. Now, obviously, week 6 versus Cincinnati, he was still recovering from the concussion that he had about a month ago. He was still in recovery, so he ended up not even playing that game in fantasy football, which obviously is going to make the difference here because he missed a game. It's basically like having a bye week, obviously. But outside of that, when he's actually played in a half PPR format, week 7 versus Philadelphia, 6.1 fantasy points. Not very playable. Week 8 versus Pittsburgh, 10.6. Okay, playable, but definitely not going to win you anything. And then week 9 versus Washington, 10.4 fantasy points. Now, here's the thing. Over this time, he's been getting peppered with targets. There's obviously no question that the targets are there, and he's going to continue to be this wide receiver 1. I'm not debating whether or not he's the wide receiver 1 in New York or not. What I'm saying here is that 9 fantasy points per game over that time frame, that's flat out not good enough to put in your wide receiver 1 or even wide receiver 2 spot in fantasy football right now. Now, am I coming out here and telling you to bench him week 10 versus the Panthers? Absolutely not. I'm not saying that you should be benching him. What I am telling you, though, is if you're going to play Malik Neighbors, you need to pair him with a high upside flex option. Somebody like a Zay Flowers comes to mind, who has got tons of upside to absolutely win you the week in fantasy football because this guy has not been able to do so. And again, we all know the reason why. He's been a total disaster. Nobody likes him. Daniel Jones at quarterback is what's holding Malik Neighbors back. But that is his reality this year in fantasy football. And we're seeing it come to fruition these past several weeks. So week 10 versus the Panthers, this is a big make or break week for you with Malik Neighbors here, because if he doesn't perform more than like 10 or 12 fantasy points, he's going to drop significantly in my rankings to the point where he may become just a flexible option moving forward, because every week is more important than the last at this point in fantasy. That's just the reality. Number 3, I have this one marked down because it's very important for this upcoming week. Detroit is the number 1 defense since week 6 in fantasy football. Their defense has been lights out in fantasy and in the real NFL. And there's a really, really important fact here that makes me want to play the Lions defense moving forward in fantasy and not play other quarterbacks here that are coming up on the docket. Number 1, they've been doing this without Aiden Hutchinson. Aiden Hutchinson got injured in week 6 versus Dallas when they had 18 fantasy points, but since then, week 7 versus Minnesota, 6 fantasy points. Playable, not great. Week 8 versus Tennessee, 16 fantasy points. Obviously, weak opponent, they did great. But week 9 versus Green Bay, 9 fantasy points. Now, here's what's important about this Green Bay game that just happened for Detroit. Detroit was coming into their first outdoor game this year because they're a dome team. That's what they are. So the questions were coming in, can they play outside? Not only were they able to play outside, they beat the brakes off the Packers in their own conditions. Like, the Packers should have been more prepared for those conditions, and it was wet and it was windy out there in Green Bay yesterday. And they were not as prepared as the Lions were. The Lions did much better against the Packers on their field than the Packers did. They manhandled the Packers on Sunday here. 12.3 fantasy points per game since week 6. So obviously the Lions here are going to be a much better play in fantasy football moving forward on a defensive perspective, and they'll definitely be in my top 12 rankings this week. But here's the deal. They're playing the Houston Texans here. Now, the Texans have not been great in fantasy football lately. CJ Stroud has been pretty bad since Nico Collins left. Nico Collins coming back here, though, is going to make a difference here. And that leads me into my next number right here. Since week 6, and that's basically the same time since Nico Collins was not there, CJ Stroud has been the quarterback 22 since week 6. I've had a lot of questions this week after the Thursday night game versus the Jets. Can I drop CJ Stroud? Is he droppable? And I said, I'm not dropping him yet personally. I don't think you should drop him. I think better days are ahead for CJ Stroud. But here's the reality with this one. CJ Stroud was the quarterback 11 in weeks 1 through 5. He was with Nico Collins, a much better quarterback in fantasy football than he was without Nico Collins here. Now again, Nico Collins coming back this week. By all accounts, he's totally ready to go. And just because I said that you shouldn't drop CJ Stroud does not necessarily mean that I think you should be playing him this week. Detroit is number 8 versus quarterbacks heading into week 9 fantasy football. So how is CJ Stroud going to perform this week against Detroit? Well, getting Nico Collins back is obviously a huge thing, but the way that Detroit is absolutely heading, they've got all the momentum here defensively, and CJ Stroud has no momentum. I wouldn't drop him right now, but I'm probably not going to end up playing him in week 10 fantasy football. Now, going down to our next one right here, Ja'Marr Chase. Obviously, he's the wide receiver 1 in fantasy football right now. He's been excellent basically the entire year. I think what you're going to get this week is a massive explosion game. Ja'Marr Chase has more than 50 reception yards versus the Baltimore Ravens with Joe Burrow throughout his career in 5 out of 6 games that he's played with Joe Burrow. Ja'Marr Chase has been pretty dominant versus the Baltimore Ravens. 3 out of 6 games were over 100 yards with Joe Burrow. So he has had some massive domination games, and one of them just came earlier this year when he almost hit 200 yards versus the Baltimore Ravens. And heading into this past week, Baltimore was dead last versus wide receivers in fantasy football. Baltimore has been atrocious versus wide receivers. And even Courtland Sutton just had a good game against the Baltimore Ravens here. So this is a matchup I really like to take advantage of. This is a Thursday night game. It's in Baltimore, but I think Ja'Marr Chase is about to have a massive week for you. Obviously, you don't consider benching Ja'Marr Chase, but just understand, this past week he didn't have the greatest week, and even in the last couple weeks, he hasn't exactly been the most dominant player in fantasy. I think you're about to have a massive week with Ja'Marr Chase. So if you're struggling right here and you're 5-4 or maybe 4-5, I think that you need to build around this Ja'Marr Chase performance this week and maybe get some safer options at the wide receiver position. And getting into our last number right here that I think is really important for week 10, the Rams defense, I've been saying for weeks, is a defense that I'm keeping a very, very close eye on. They've been playing much better every single week of this season. And the Rams defense since week 6 is the number 2 defense in fantasy football. They are absolutely breaking onto the scene in fantasy football. Their young pass rusher, Jared Verse, is an animal. This is Khalil Mack reincarnated. This guy is bull rushing and absolutely abusing offensive tackles here. They've got tons of other young pieces on that defense that are making them a great defense in fantasy. And this is with a week 6 bye week. By the way, they're the number 2 defense with a week 6 bye week. Week 7 versus the Las Vegas Raiders, 17 fantasy points. That's a great week, obviously. I called them a very good start that week, but I didn't peg them as a great play in week 8 versus the Vikings when they ended up having 6 points against the Vikings offense. That's a really good week. And then what they just did versus the Seattle Seahawks, they made Geno Smith look like a dummy. They got this guy to turn the ball over so many times, and they had 22 fantasy points in this game. 22 fantasy points. This is a defense averaging 15 fantasy points per game over the last several weeks in fantasy football. And you think defense can't win you championships? No, this is a great defense to have in fantasy. With the Rams here, they're playing the Miami Dolphins here in week 10. They're going to be in the top 12 in all likelihood tomorrow in some form or fashion. So make sure to stay tuned for the defense rankings here. But I think that this defense here is a defense that you can just look to moving forward as a potential option at the very least, because their defense is developing. This is not a fluke against bad opponents here. Their defense I've been watching, they're getting better. They've got young pieces that are actually helping this team win football games, man. They have been really good, so definitely at the very least, you got to keep an eye on the Rams defense moving forward. So let me know how your team did in week 9, and if you want to see the waiver wire pickups for week 10 fantasy football, click on this video right here.